I want to focus on the political aspects of this because, in my view, there is nothing new in terms of a lot of what we're seeing this year. The American politics has a long and often dishonorable history in relation to China. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which you all know about, and barred citizens of the entire country from immigrating to the U.S. It was the first prohibition ever of a specific ethnic group. Came after the Chinese immigrants had played a huge role in, for example, building the Trans-Pacific Railroad or Transcontinental Railroad. And after political leaders during the economic distress of the 1870s blamed Chinese Americans for, quote, depressed wages. Does it sound familiar? And one of the leading xenophobes then was the governor of California. President Hayes vetoed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1876, but it was passed in 1882. One of its provisions was that you couldn't become a citizen even if you were a Chinese immigrant. They had to be permanent aliens. Does that sound a little familiar too? That was one of the proposals we heard from the so-called moderates in the Republican primaries this year, that basically you'd have a path to legality but not citizenship, a form of kind of apartheid in America. Some Chinese could still enter the country, but in 1924, all classes of Chinese and Asian immigrants were excluded. This was popular, supported by Southern conservatives, organized labor, Northern politicians committed to keeping the country ethnically the way it was. This didn't change till 1943 with the Magnuson Act. China was an ally in World War II, so you couldn't insult them all the time. And so Chinese immigrants could, A, become citizens, and we could have Chinese immigration. You know what, Stan knows, but the quota was 105 people a year. John F. Kennedy wrote a book called Nation of Immigrants, and as president pushed very hard to dump the quota system and change the whole immigration system. After he died, his brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, fought very hard for this bill, and it was signed into law in 1956 by Lyndon Johnson. So there's this background, and that's why I think it doesn't matter whether or not they live in zones where they're affected by globalization or Chinese trade. I think there's this whole background in American history where people have stereotypes and shibboleths in their head and they react to them. And specifically, by the way, there were presidential campaigns across the 20th century where China was a major or even central issue. First, spurred by Senator Joseph McCarthy and his critics about communists in the State Department who had lost China. By the way, why was it ours to lose? Who had lost China to the communists. The Republican campaign of 1952 played successfully on enormous animus toward China. It was so bad that General Eisenhower was then running for president on the Republican ticket, would not defend General George C. Marshall, his boss in World War II, when Joe McCarthy called him a traitor. In 1960, China again came back into our politics. John Kennedy said in the second presidential debate that Quemoy and Matsu, these rocky little islands off the coast of China, were strategically indefensible and certainly not worth a major war with China. Richard Nixon, who had been integral to the Red Scare strategy in 1952, pounced. The islands were part of the zone of freedom. The dispute continued through the second and third and fourth debates, with Kennedy arguing that Nixon could take the country to war over these offshore islands, even if there was no Chinese attack on Formosa, that is Taiwan. Nixon accused Kennedy of being soft. It's unclear how the issue shaped the election, although Kennedy's position was actually on the merits closer to the Eisenhower administration's. As president, Kennedy actually was soft on China, or he yearned to be. He toyed with the idea of recognizing Outer Mongolia as a first step toward ending the delusion that China wasn't China. He was deterred by the looming 1964 election, just as he was deterred, we now know from some of the memoirs, from beginning what he wanted to do in Vietnam, which was to disentangle the United States. Thought it could only be done after he was safely reelected. So nothing, then we're in Vietnam, China's an ally of Vietnam, and during those years, nothing happens. It was actually his 1960 rival, we all know, the Cold Warrior Richard Nixon, who not only changed the China policy, and he had the credentials to do it, nobody could say he was soft on communism, but he didn't wait till after the '72 election. He did it, and he celebrated it as a huge achievement in a series of commercials. This, although, by the way, his opponent, George McGovern, had called in the mid-1960s for rethinking China policy. His visit to Beijing was recorded and celebrated in his television ads from one end of the campaign to the other. So then you get full normalization under Ronald Reagan. And I want to do an analogy of what happened in the 80s, because I love that website, you know, China owns us. Well, in the 80s, this guy could have run a website that said Japan owns us, because people had this same set of fears that somehow or other America was going to be completely taken over. My God, the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center. These guys just bought some movie theaters. And that lasted until, and it became an issue in campaigns. And, you know, in 1988, there were people who were talking about we had to do something about this. It died out in the 90s, obviously, as Japan entered the long stagnation which endures to this day. One side note that we can't ignore, Tiananmen Square and human rights plays a role, or both play a role, in how American politicians who otherwise might be well disposed toward China react. Nancy Pelosi, for example, has been a consistent opponent of normalizing trade with China, letting China into the world trade, all of that. And but for the most part, Democratic candidates or presidents, not just presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, have talked more about human rights in campaigns and then have approached China very realistically once they're in office. Now, I want to show you, how much is this an issue in this campaign? I want to show you something, okay?
Let's say China. 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 You go over to China. 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 You take China.
China.
China. I love them. China. 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 I have to have my China. China. China because China. 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 China, 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 China now, China, China. You know, China.
I know China very well. China, 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 China.
China, China, China.
Northwest Wisconsin, where I'm from.
It's China to me, China. China, 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 China. You want to buy from China? That's great. Buy from China. Buy toys from China. China in particular. China. China. I have people that I know in China. China. China.
Anyway, that's enough. It gives you a sense of China. I think is one of the two most frequent words for countries that appear in his campaigning. China and Mexico. And for me, I guess it's funny, but it's really dangerous. We obviously have real differences and real opportunities for cooperation with China, but this kind of demagogic and at times almost incoherent appeal has nothing constructive to contribute to that. And in fact, if Chinese elites think that this guy would be passive and pragmatic, then they're drinking Trump Kool-Aid. He would not be. His base would never permit him to be. And he would want to get renominated in 2020. In effect, though, if you look at what he's done, he's revived the racist stereotype of the wily Oriental. The Chinese make great deals, and American leaders are dumb. They just get taken care of taken advantage of. One of the legacies of this campaign, even if he loses, will be to embed with millions of Americans the idea that they're economically crushed because we're not tough enough with China, and we're too weak on Mexico. A lot of sheer ignorance here. For example, I'm certain that a majority of voters, and maybe you could tell us, a majority of voters, or at least a plurality, would answer, if they knew what it was, that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, includes China, which of course it doesn't. In fact, it's designed to sort of provide a counterweight to China. But Trump talks about them one sentence after another as though they're exactly the same. Now, you know, China, they're using our country as a piggy bank. I mean, there are many different ways. He is going all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Every stereotype, every shibboleth has been paraded. Hillary Clinton isn't engaging frontally on the real concerns with China. in part because she had to abandon the TPP to get the Democratic nomination. In the first debate, she confined herself to claiming an increase in U.S. exports to China while she was Secretary of State, and deriding Trump's tweet that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. We obviously have genuine, contentious, big, consequential questions about what's going to happen. A lot of people here know far more about that than I do, and about the security questions, including in the South China Sea, the development of China as a consumer and importing economy, which is fundamental, I think, to getting the world economy back in good shape. But there has been, there is a stinging backlash against globalization. And I would argue that it doesn't matter whether or not people live in areas that are affected by globalization. They hear about it, they fasten on to the word, and they can blame it for whatever dissatisfactions they have. So you take that, you take the element of race, you take the stereotypes about China, and you have what Trump is doing. It's not clear to me that he could in any way evade the demands and expectations of his own base if he was president. If he did, he wouldn't be renominated, and if he did what he says, I also believe he'd be a one-term president, assuming we all survived. And if Hillary Clinton is elected, which I do expect, she'll be a hard-headed realist in dealing with China. And her realism will lead to some military tensions and possibly to new economic arrangements that make sense. Freer trade's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for years to come because of what's happened in both parties. And this, too, I'm confident of. China has been a recurring issue in our campaigns for good and for bad. It's an issue now, and it will be again. And the hope and the challenge, given that these are the two biggest economies in the world, I don't share the optimism of the Chinese that they're, of a lot of the Chinese, that they are the biggest economy in the world yet. Well, they are the two biggest economies in the world. And my hope is that somehow or other you'll have a president that will work it out so that that reality effectively works for the majority of people in both countries, and that then China doesn't, it would be, you know how we would know it all worked? China wouldn't be an issue in any U.S. campaign, just as we don't have big issues like the United Kingdom, or, I mean, that would tell us that we were doing better. Anyway, I promised I would be as short as I could, so I've cut what I was going to say. Thank you very much.